tell it's humid today because the camera on this computer sort of looks like it's gonna be fog. All righty, we'll go ahead and get started. It's great to see so many folks here. I have had quite a week, just like really disruptive week in terms of either my husband or I being gone every night, which makes obviously tricky with the kiddo. So I have not graded exam 3. I plan to get it done either this weekend or actually tonight while folks are doing assessments with each other. The game plan for today is to do our last lecture for the semester. We're going to talk about the assessment report and interviewing in general. And then after the break, you all will pair up and do a intake. So essentially, the first thing you would do when a client walked in your office, what questions you do ask them? And I have a cheat sheet all made up for you all so that you can use it. Next week, I'm away at a conference. You have a group work day scheduled. Is any group going to be to the point where you need to be using SPSS yet? Cool. You all can use your own time. And what I've done in the past, if groups are ready to use SPSS, is had another faculty member come in for like the first hour to help y'all out. But since no one's there yet, we'll just do that. We have like another 2 work days after that. Another work day. for sure that I will help everyone with SPSS that day. If we need to, the last time I taught this class, I made a time on reading day where I was available in the computer lab to help everybody with SPSS, right? So I will make it happen, and we will fight the computers. We will make it happen. Honestly, just download it on your computers. It'll be a lot better. Cool, but I know a couple of the groups got feedback from Dr. Martorell on your IRBs. A couple more of the groups, I either owe feedback to, or you'll be submitting very soon, which is awesome. And then once you get the approval from Dr. Martorell, you're ready to collect your data. So that's something else you could do next week, particularly if you're doing pencil and paper questionnaires. Go around campus, find people, get you 30 people. You can probably do it in the library and the grill during class time next week. I don't know if I told you all this story or not, but I had a group one time that forgot to include a demographics question here when they passed it out. And I was like, it's fine, you just won't do those questions. They're like, no, we're gonna do it right. And they went during work time during class, and in like 45 minutes, they collected 30 more people who were just hanging out in the grill. So you don't have to do it that quickly, but you could do it that quickly if you needed to. I will be available via email, but I will be on Seattle time. So I might be a little like answering your emails at very strange times next week. But we're getting near the end. I'm really excited. It's also a good time that if your group's at a good place, next week is a nice time, and you don't have to come use this really warm classroom. You can pair up with your partner for the assessments and, you know, get caught up on all the assessments you need to do. That's one of the things we'll go over today too, is what all are you going to need for that assessment report. So I recommend you use that time and use it to your best advantage. The following week, that Thursday, is Thanksgiving. I will not be here. You should not be here, right? And then we'll have another 3-hour workday for you all to again catch up on assessments, probably be doing SPSS that day. And then the following Thursday is our quote unquote exam time, when y'all will be presenting your posters, which we're just gonna put up here so that we don't kill part of a tree by printing them. So but it should be a fun time. All right, any questions about logistics coming up? Yeah. Yes, so I will pass that out after Thanksgiving break, and then you'll have a week to do it. It'll be due the last day. I guess I could have done it tonight, but I'm like, I still owe you exam 3. I don't want to like stress you out worrying about that one. So yeah, you'll get the exam the week after Thanksgiving. It'll be due during our panel presentations. And it'll be the exact same format. It's not cumulative. It'll just be the last 3 chapters. Good question. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when we do our final presentations, that's at the same time we usually have.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really nice that they've just stuck with last times for night classes for that. There was one year where it was really confusing, and they were like, you might use your class time, but you might not. I was like, what are we supposed to do? I was a pretty young professor. So yeah, they've just stuck with, it'll be a Thursday at 6, which is really nice. It's also the first day of exam, so then you'll have this one like done and dusted. Any other questions? Awesome. Okay. So today, like I said, some of this we've kind of brushed over already when we were talking about personality assessment, but I'll review it to talk about interviewing the client. This is like the most important thing you can do. This is where you get the most information, honestly, when you're interacting with a client. This gives you a really nice baseline. This gives you an idea of what they think is going on. And sometimes, especially if they're coming in for like, let's say an ADHD type issue, you can tell during the interview if it's manifesting, right? If the person kind of stares off into space when they're supposed to be answering with you, or if you're interviewing a kid and their parents and the kid just can't sit still, right? Things like that can be a really nice indicator. But first, we're gonna touch on the assessment report. This is the deliverable or end product of the assessment process. Just one sec, I just realized that if I want to have captions on my YouTube video for this, and I need to turn on the Zoom captions. It doesn't capture the Google ones in the same way. Alrighty. So, and depending on, I mean, you should always take your time and make this as pristine as you can, because you're giving the client important information, if nothing else. But there are certain situations where you better be very, very careful when you do this. And write as if you are writing the most beautiful, careful piece of prose. Because let's say you're doing this for a court case. Any sentence that you write could be questioned in court. So you want to make sure you are accurate, there's no typos. I mean, it sounds so silly, but you don't want to look unprofessional and have your report brought into question because of it, right? Especially because in forensic situations in particular, I did a job shadow with a forensic psychologist when I was a sophomore in college. And she told me she only goes to testify maybe every 6 months or so. The vast majority of the time, the judge just takes her report and uses that. Does not have her come testify. So like you really want your report to speak for itself. So reports have been used to respond to the referral questions being asked. So the referral question is often from the client themselves. I'm feeling depressed, right? What do I do about it? But sometimes it's from another professional. You might get someone saying, hey, I think this person might be having some anxiety. Can you assess for that? Or this kid is really struggling in math class. Let's figure out what's going on there. If this is a client you're going to see for therapy, this can provide you insight into your treatment planning and thinking about what will be most helpful for them. And then the same token, it can help in the case conceptualization process. And case conceptualization is a fancy word for just sort of how you think about your client holistically. It can also help to develop treatment options. So like the type of counseling you're going to use. Are you going to want to refer this person for medication? Things along those lines. To suggest educational service for students with special needs. So students with learning delays, learning disabilities, things along those lines. To offer direction if you're providing vocational rehab services. So trying to get someone back into the job. Or someone who's never been able to be in a job. So for example, if you're at a grocery store and you see folks who probably have developmental delays who are bagging your groceries, right? Those folks have gone through vocational programs to be able to work in the community. To offer insight about treatment options for individuals who have incurred some sort of cognitive impairment, like a brain injury or even dementia. To assist the courts in making difficult decisions. So things like custody decisions, sanity defenses, rare cases, even determination of guilt or innocence. And then to provide evidence for placement into school and jobs, particularly jobs like public service, firefighters, police officers. And to challenge decisions made by institutions and agencies. So, you might be asked to evaluate someone when they want to challenge or appeal their Social Security claim, or if they think that the school-based psychologist, their assessment wasn't right and wasn't giving them the IEP that they need. So when you gather the information, it really is sort of a garbage in, garbage out scenario. You need to get good info in order to write a good report. So how do you gather the information for the report is as important as writing the report. And gathering the information, you want to take into account both the breadth and the depth of your assessment procedures. So breadth here would be based on the purpose of the report, making sure you cast a wide enough net. You're asking all the questions you need to be asking. And depth is assuring that you're using techniques that reflect the intensity of the issues being examined. So for example, if someone comes to you and they might have a psychotic disorder, something like schizophrenia. The SCID that some of you used for the first time last week doesn't include psychosis. You need a separate diagnostic interview for psychosis, right? So you would need to make sure you're trained in that and that you have it available to use. Depth is making sure you're getting like enough detail, basically, that you're getting you're really keying in on the issue. And so interviews themselves can take several different formats. And the interview does several things. It sets the tone that this is a professional setting, that this is not just talking to a friend, right? That you are someone who's here to help, but the way you do that is very distinct from sort of a day-to-day helping, right? It allows the client to become desensitized to sharing very intimate and personal information. You have to ask a lot of this during the first session. And so they sort of get used to that. It allows the examiner to assess the nonverbals, as I was just talking about. Is this person jittering their leg, right? So we look at anxiety. Do they show up kind of looking like they haven't showered in a week? Ooh, let's look at depression or dementia, right? Can they engage in low self-care? It also allows the examiner to learn firsthand the problem areas of the client and put them into perspective. It also gives the client and the examiner the opportunity to see if they can work together. And it is perfectly okay to not go with the first therapist you ever. If this is for therapy or even examiner, if you ever have to go for an assessment and you sit down with that person and it just doesn't feel like they're taking you seriously, go get a second opinion, right? I think a lot of people think like, okay, I got this person, I'm stuck with them, they're gonna help or not, and that's all I can do. But in fact, you are allowed to fire your therapist. You're allowed to realize you might not work well together. You know, I had a client when I was in grad school who decided she wanted a different therapist, fine with me. But because I spent too much time in the interview asking her questions. You know, like, wow, I guess I just didn't do a good job explaining what the interview was, then, right? That it wasn't a back and forth, I needed to gather information. But even to give you the other way, a personal example, when I had my postpartum depression, I had a therapist before that, but my therapist was also on maternity leave. She had a kid about almost exactly a month after I had my kiddo. But she'd given me some references in case this happened, right? She kind of knew that might happen. And so I was able to connect with a really good psychiatrist, like best in the area, specializes in postpartum issues. But at the time, she was working for a clinic that required I see a therapist within their clinic. And the person that I saw, at first I thought was going to be great. She's like, I use evidence-based treatments and this and that. And then like the actual therapy was not that helpful. She would be like, she had 3 things she would tell you to do, like read this book, try this meditation. And I'm like blanking on the third one, so I blocked it, I think. And like I was having a really difficult time with the decision I had to make. And you know, came in wanting to talk it over. And she just had these platitudes, like, all you can do is all you can do, and that is enough. And I was like, this is not helpful. And I had postpartum depression, so I'm crying in session. She's doing nothing to comfort me. So I left that session, and that's the first time I've ever ghosted another professional. I just never called her back. It was several months into my treatment, and so I emailed my old therapist, and I'm like, please tell me you're off maternity leave, and she said, yes, I am. So, therapists, I never heard her like, oh, my feelings are hurt, you didn't call me back, right? I'm sure she got other clients, and I'm sure her techniques worked for other people. They just didn't work for me. And so therapists, psychologists, like anybody else, you kind of need to shop around sometimes to find someone who will take you seriously and that the two of you work well together. So last week we talked about diagnosis and structured interviews. This week I brought in my DSMs, so if anyone over the break wants to look. I have the 4TR, the 5, and then the new 5TR, which doesn't really change much from the 5. And so the structured interview, like the SKID that we did parts of, is that it offers broad enough areas of content to cover topics that you might otherwise have missed or forgotten to ask. So like the SKID, especially with the screener, basically asks about all the most commonly diagnosed disorders that you see in outpatient therapy. And that's your breadth of coverage. It increases reliability of results by ensuring that all of the items that you need to cover will be covered. And it ensures the examiner will cover all these items because they're listed in detail and there's an expectation that they will be covered. It also ensures that these items won't be missed due to interviewee or interviewer even embarrassment, right? You gotta ask them all. There are some drawbacks, however. If I were just to do a structured interview, I'm not really establishing rapport with my client, which is one of the most important things. Research has shown that about 40% of the success of therapy is down to common factors, and the most important of those is the relationship between the therapist and the client. Right, so I need to start establishing that from day one. And I might miss information because these items are predetermined and you don't feel as free to go off on a tangent or a hunch. And clients may experience the interview as dehumanizing. The way you have to ask something like the questions on the SKID is very robotic. So I would always do, in fact, we were trained to, you do your unstructured interview first, and then you would do your structured interview. And when I would switch to the SKID, I would tell them, okay, now I'm going to do this much more structured interview. I'm going to sound completely different. I have to use specific language. It might even sound robotic. Just bear with me. This will help me get more information about it. And then they were cool with it. Clients, particularly minorities, may misinterpret or be unfamiliar with certain items or the way things are phrased. Follow up by the examiner to alleviate any confusion on the part of examinee is less likely as compared to when you're doing unstructured or other types of interviewing. And it doesn't always allow for depth because the interviewer is more concerned with gathering information than detail about a particularly sensitive area. So the unstructured interview is essentially where you sit down and you just chat. The therapist asks you questions, and they can ask follow-ups, tangents, whatever they need to do. So it creates an atmosphere that's more conducive to building rapport. It allows the client to feel as if they are directing the interview. That's allowing the client to discuss what they deem most important. It offers the potential for greater depth of information because the clinician can focus in on a particularly sensitive area and possibly uncover some underlying issues that the client might otherwise avoid revealing. There are some drawbacks, unfortunately. The interviewer might miss information because they're caught up in the client's story instead of following a prescribed set of questions. The interviewer may end up spending more time on some items than they might like. And you can do what's called a semi-structured interview, where you basically kind of do a combo, and that has the advantages and the drawbacks of both. What I was trained to do and what's ideal in my opinion is to do both. You start with your unstructured and then you do structured. In a managed care setting, however, like a private practice, like working for a hospital, things along those lines, you don't always have the freedom to take the time to do both. So in those cases, you prioritize the unstructured, so you can build that rapport. And you kind of do like a mini version of the structured for the diagnoses you think they might have, basically. You can also do computer-driven assessments. And computer-driven assessment reports have become very sophisticated and as reliable as structured interviews. Some programs ask clients to divulge detailed information, like presenting problems, legal issues, their living situation, tentative diagnoses, their emotional state, treatment recommendations, mental status, health and habits, disposition, behavioral, physical descriptions. You can cut and paste some of the computer-generated report into the assessment report you write. However, the examiner, you, the person assessing them, is always responsible for the end product. So you need to make sure you're not just copying it willy-nilly. So these would be the client actually sits down at a computer, fills it out, and then it will actually create paragraphs for you that you can put in your report. So choosing an appropriate assessment instrument is based on the purpose of the assessment and the breadth and depth needed to do an adequate assessment. So after considering everything we've just talked about and everything we've talked about throughout the class, you choose from all the kinds of assessment instruments. And it's important only to use instruments that are appropriate to the purpose of your assessment, otherwise you're practicing unethically. So someone comes to me and they say, I have depression, right? And as we're going through the interview, I'm realizing there's something else going on here, right? It is perfectly appropriate at that point, if I suspect it, to ask them if they've ever had any sort of difficulties in school. And, if they say, yeah, I've always felt like I needed more time. Sometimes reading's really hard for me. It's perfectly appropriate to say, would you be interested in doing some testing to see if you have a learning disability? And either conducting it yourself or referring them to someone who specializes in those. But it would not be appropriate to screen every person for a learning disability if you didn't think they had it, if that makes sense, especially since some of those tests are very long. So these circle us back to the ethics code we talked about at the beginning of the semester. So counselors, if you're in a counseling psychology position, are responsible for the appropriate application, scoring, interpretation, and use of assessment instruments relevant to the needs of the client, whether they score, interpret such assessments themselves, or use technology or other services. So that's how your book always talks about, like, the role of helpers. You can have psychodiagnosticians, who are people who are basically like y'all right after you graduate, who are trained to give and score the assessments, and then the clinician who's already licensed would write the report. And then from the APA ethics code, psychologists administer, adapt, score, interpret, or use assessment techniques, interviews, tests, or instruments in a manner and for the purposes that are appropriate in light of the research on or evidence of the usefulness and proper application of the techniques. So it's practicing well and practicing ethically to make sure you're doing your assessments well and appropriately. Now, in terms of writing the report itself, one of the things that you need to be aware of is that, especially now with HIPAA and FERPA, clients typically have access to their records. So not only, let's say you're writing this for a school setting, not only will the teacher see the report, but the parents will get a copy of the report, right? So for that reason, you need to make sure you're writing in a way that's accessible to someone who is not super trained in psychology, right? But also that is, how do I say this? I guess there's not like a PC way to say this. You can't like be mocking or degrading, and one would hope you wouldn't do that anyway as an ethical practitioner, right? But like you have to be extra careful, you're sensitive and say things in a way that doesn't sound like this person is stupid or this person is crazy, right? The Freedom of Information Act, they can also request things that way as well. So when you're writing the assessment report, this would be either in practice or when you're doing it for this course, there are a bunch of suggestions your book offers here. One is to omit passive verbs to write in an active voice. As I was just mentioning, reduce the use of jargon. Don't write it as if you're writing it for only other psychologists. Don't use a patronizing tone. They suggest subheadings, and we're going to go over the assessment report template today. You will see there are subheadings galore. Reduce the use of and define acronyms. Personally, even when I publish my research, I do not like to overuse acronyms. Because I hate when I'm reading an article and they're using 10 acronyms. And I keep having to remind myself what the heck these different acronyms mean. So even though it costs more words and more space, I typically will type everything out. To minimize the number of difficult words, again, that kind of goes along with the jargon. To use shorter rather than longer words, to make sure your paragraphs are concise and flow well. And you want to make sure you, in addition, a lot of what you do in assessment is going to be pointing out weaknesses, right? Diagnoses, disabilities, things along those lines. So you always want to make sure you point out their strengths as well. This is again, I think a problem with younger, inexperienced clinicians. I think if I make this sound really fancy and really great, I'll dazzle people and they'll just see my brilliance. And like, the best report is one that is actually helpful, right? That other people can read and apply. When possible, describe behaviors that are representative of client issues. So again, if you're talking about something like ADHD, talk about how they might have been inattentive or had a hard time sitting still during the assessment process. If you're talking about them being depressed, talk about if they are speaking in a monotone or really slowly. Only label when it's necessary and valuable to do so for the client's well-being. So for example, you're in a managed care setting where you take health insurance, you're going to have to give a diagnosis in order for that client to have their insurance pay for their care. If you're in a private practice setting where that client is paying out of pocket, I know plenty of actually like really respected psychologists in the field who do not use diagnosis in those cases. Instead, they focus in on the symptoms specifically. Another example is, let's say you're writing a not guilty by reason of insanity report for the courts. They don't care what diagnosis you would give that person. Your question you are answering in that scenario is this person sane or insane by the definition given in this jurisdiction? It's usually something like, did they know right from wrong at the time of the crime? They don't care if you're going to give this person a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They just want to know at the time the crime was committed, did they know right from wrong? Write the report so a non-mental health professional can understand it, like a teacher, the client themselves. And don't be afraid to take a stand if you feel strongly that the information warrants it. So if the information believes you, the client is in danger of harming themselves. A, don't wait till you write your assessment report to do something about that, right? That's something you usually want to address right away. But B, be really clear about it. So report formats can differ depending on the setting you're writing it for, depending on the referral question. But they can include a whole host of different information, so demographics, age, ethnicity, first language, occupation, things like that. Their presenting problem or reason for the referral or for the report. Information about their family background. Not only what was it like for them growing up and what's their interaction like now, but also is there a family history of whatever you're assessing for? Significant past medical or counseling history. Any substance use or abuse. Vocational and educational history. Other pertinent background information that you think is important. For example, if they've served in the military and you're trying to diagnose them with PTSD, that's pretty relevant, right? We should probably include that information. Their mental status, which again, to remind you, mental status is, are they aware of like what's going on right now, right? And sometimes you will formally test this, and other times you'll do it just based on, were they able to find your office and show up on time? Do they present us fairly put together? Any results of those assessments that you did? Diagnoses if appropriate. And then summary and conclusions, and then you almost always finish with some sort of recommendations. So demographic info, and this is for your report in particular. We've got things on there like your name, name of the interviewer, name of your partner, your client for the project, age, sex, marital status, ethnicity. Presenting problems. So this would be the client's statement or description of why they're coming to see you. Again, remember, as you do this interview with your partner, you get to decide if you're being you, and you can just talk about, like, I've had a lot of people who write about school stress, fair, right? Or if you want to play a character. I had a student one time who just like, he was schizophrenic the whole semester. He was not actually schizophrenic, but his partner had a really interesting report, right? And then any history of the problem and related factors. So for example, when I was working in the clinic, if someone came in with depression and, or like PTSD symptoms, you'd want to kind of start pushing for what else is going on in your life, have you lost someone pretty recently? What is your traumatic event? Things along those lines. Then you want to look at family background. So their upbringing and how that might be related to the presenting problem. So again, if they're presenting for PTSD and there's a history of abuse, right? That's important to get some detail about. The first session, I usually don't push for a lot of detail, but just enough. But other useful things you might want to mention, where they grew up, if they have siblings, what are the sexes and ages of their siblings? Did they come from a family of divorce or single parents or an intact family? And if there was an intact family, was that worse than maybe if their parents had divorced, right? That happens sometimes. Who took care of them, right? A lot of times we just assume it's mom and dad, but for a lot of folks it's not. It's aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa who are their primary caregiver, right? Significant others who may have impacted on the client's life. And again, sometimes that's not nuclear family, right? Sometimes like your most influential person is like grandpa, right? Important stories from childhood that may have affected how they define themselves. And then for adults, you want to look at like marital status and whether there are marital issues, if they have kids, that type of thing. When I was working with mostly college students, I would ask about their roommates and how they got along, things along those lines. Although that would go more into like friends. Educational and vocational history. You want to look at their educational background and their job path or career focus. And so again, for if everyone is playing themselves for this, right? It's more about like, Okay, like how do you decide to go where to college? How do you decide your major? What do you want to do after you graduate? What jobs do you work to pay for college, right? And then other pertinent information can be things like legal concerns, if they bring up their sexuality as an issue they're struggling with, financial problems, things along those lines. Now, in terms of the mental status exam, this is simply often just a 1 or 2 paragraph statement that assesses a client's appearance and behavior, emotional state, thought components, and cognitive functioning. So appearance and behavior can include their observable appearance and behaviors during the interview, dress, hygiene, right? Do they smell? Do they look like, again, maybe they haven't been able to care for themselves. I had a client who was very depressed and she would only shower once a week because that's all she could get herself to do, right? This isn't judgmental. You're looking for clues. Their body posture, if they have any tics, look at their nonverbals, like eye contact, or if they have anxious things, right? Wringing their hands, things like that. Manner of speech, their tone, if there's any sort of stuttering or other speech difficulties. You also look at things like speech pattern and content, how quickly they talk. Are they relevant when they answer you? Like if you ask a question about substance abuse, can they answer a question about substance abuse? Are they going off on a tangent? Right? Are they coherent? Is it easy to understand what they're saying? And then emotional state, you look at their affect and their mood. Affect is your current feeling state. So do they seem happy, sad, angry, depressed? You could think about it as appropriate or inappropriate to the content, right? So some people, when they have certain, especially psychotic disorders, they'll talk about something that's actually really sad and they'll laugh, and they're not like being cruel. Just the wiring in their brain is so crossed that that's what happens for them. But you can also think about like flat affect, blunted, not really showing a lot of range, exaggerated, and more. Mood is more of a long-term underlying emotional well-being. They may seem anxious or sad and report that their mood has been depressed, for example. Then you want to write up your assessment results. And again, I'm going to go over the template and show you all how you will write these up for your report. You want to begin with a list of the assessments you performed. And then offer the results. You don't want to give raw scores because those are going to be meaningless, right? Even if I said something like this person had an IQ of 115, everyone in this room now knows that means they're a standard deviation above the mean, and so they're pretty smart. But the average Joe on the street or the average Jane on the street isn't going to know that, right? So instead you report about like being above average instead of reporting those raw scores. So you might talk about it in terms of like percentiles compared to other people. Remember that clients, parents, or other non-professionals may read the results. So you want to state the results in understandable, unbiased language. You want to be concise yet cover all the items relevant to the presenting concerns, or items that clearly stand out as a result of the assessment. You want to present those results as objectively as possible. Interpretation should be kept to a minimum as well. Your summary and conclusions are really where you pull together everything that you've written about so far. Often this is the only section of the report that's read by others. I think I mentioned in here before that when I was doing pre-surgical evaluation for folks undergoing bariatric surgery, for one of the 2 surgeons, the like front desk workers would print out the report and highlight just like this paragraph and maybe like 1 or 2 other sentences, so that's all he would read. And our reports were short; they were like a page and a half, front and back. That was it. So you want to make sure this part is especially clear, and you want to be accurate and don't leave out any main points. Want to be succinct, you want to be relevant. Don't like surprise that new information here, introduce it earlier. And although inferences can be made, they must be logical, sound, defendable, and based on what you actually have in your report. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's typically recommended that you mention the strengths of your client here as well. The recommendations is the last section, and this should be based on all your information gathered. It should make logical sense to the reader themselves. Some prefer to write this as a paragraph. I ended up preferring listed this as like a bullet point type thing, just because that's how a couple of my supervisors did it, and it just started making logical sense to me that way. And then typically you sign it. Now, more often than not, it is electronically signed. But back in the day, we would actually sign. And then if you have any sort of supervisor, they would also sign off on it. Because when you are in training, you're actually practicing under the license of your supervisor, since you're not licensed yet. Your book has a nice little summary of this as well. And I'm going to go ahead and go on over to the template y'all will be using. And actually, before I show you this, let me show you where you find this. So if you go to our Blackboard page, and then you go to Assessment Report Materials, there is the template. Right above that is where you'll turn this in at the end of the semester. And I believe I now also have all of the assessments y'all have done throughout the throughout the semester posted here too. So lots of, if there's anything you've missed, you can just print it out for yourself. I also have like scoring information when that's relevant as well. And so back over to our template. And let me get this so it's actually legible. There we go. All right. So as I mentioned, you're going to start with your name, the person writing the report. And then the client name. This will be your partner you've been doing the assessments on. The reason there's names in parentheses is that in a real world setting, you might have this in case you're doing couples therapy or family therapy, right? Where you list more than one. And then date of report, you guys can just put like the date you're going to turn it in, which is the last day of the semester. And then your person's age, sex, marital status, ethnicity, and then your year in school and major, and or their occupation. Again, as I mentioned, a bunch of you work as well as go to school, right? So you can include that. I have all the sources of info right here at the front. So this is already there. You don't need to retype this or do anything with it. It's here for you. And then this is what's going to come today. So today y'all are going to do the intake interview, the unstructured interview on each other. This is the information you will get from that. And there's a question for each of these, so it'll be pretty easy to fill in. So their statement description of what their problem is, history of the problem, related factors. You should write this part in, actually you should write the whole report in complete sentences instead of just a word or two. And then you got family and social history. So their childhood would be under historical information, and then current living arrangements and support systems. Employment and educational information, those behavioral observations. And then you have your assessment results. And so you're going to have information from the SCID. And then these are those questionnaires you filled out maybe a month ago about depression and anxiety and sentence completion. And then this is the one you did over spring break. And then this is that R-bands, the one with the figure you had to copy and all that good stuff. Then we go way back to the beginning of the semester when you did the GRE problems, right? So you should always make sure Your partner has your results for those. And then you're gonna write your summary and conclusions and your recommendations. And then I have, again, how this used to look back in the day when we actually printed them and signed them. So that's how you'll write this up. Typically, once you get the information in here, the template itself is 4 pages. It usually ends up 5 or 6 pages when you fill stuff in. I'm not expecting this to be, 300 pages long. You're just filling in a few sentences for each, or just 1 sentence of the relevant information. Alrighty, so that is actually all for our lecture part today. So why don't we go ahead and take our 15-minute break now? It's about 6:45, so come back around 7:05, and I'll get you all set up with that unstructured interview to do with your partner. Yeah. No, the rest of the time will be for y'all if you need to catch up on other assessments or work with your group. Okay. Sure. And Nathan is on Zoom if you want to talk to him about
So when we expect the revisions for this, she asked a question about.
Oh, right.
Yes, about.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that is more for when we didn't like staple things together, would be different pages, we want to try to make sure you have them all together. Are you guys gonna do, I'm trying to remember, like with paper copies or, okay, perfect. So yeah, you can just say, you're not gonna be able to do this, take it all together and be able to let it in.
Okay, so I can remove this.
Exactly, and then when you write back, or basically take the letter she gave you and underneath, put kind of say what you do. Yeah. And just say, yeah, and thank you for noticing that.
So do I just like remove the whole thing or just say like you're just looking at all this survey, like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the data will be, the 3 you and Ethan, like, they'll probably help you with your PSS at some point. Okay, perfect, yeah.
We need the house, letter. Let's say, the only thing we change is the thing that we changed this. Like, take out that and then.
And Caitlin and Nathan, I'm gonna repoint out where you all can find this. So when you are on Zoom, or when you are on Blackboard, I'm gonna type this out for you. You go to assessment report. And then at the very bottom, there's the unstructured interview. So you can print that out, make time with your partner in the future. So I'm actually gonna end the Zoom because otherwise it'll just be a bunch of dead air for y'all. And have a good night.